Welcome, everyone. Good morning for those in the US. Good afternoon for those from Europe, and good evening for those who are in Asia. Welcome to Sci-Tech Asia webinar series. Today, it is our pleasure to have Dr. Nicolas Sternsdorff-Cisterna as our speaker. Dr. Sternsdorff-Cisterna is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at South Methodist University. He is also the author of the book called Food Safety After Fukushima: Scientific Citizenships and the Politics of Risk, published by University of Hawaii Press in 2019. He specializes in the studies of food, science, and technology with a focus on Japan. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Sternsdorff-Cisterna. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you. And I want to thank the Sci-Tech Asia and Gonzalo Santos, Yichen Rao, and Jun Sang for their help in setting this up and allowing me this chance to share my research with you. My talk today is entitled Intimacy, Techno Intimacy, and Food Safety After the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Disaster. So, in the fall of 2018, I attended an event at an upscale sort of neighborhood in Tokyo. And this event was designed to promote Fukushima Prefecture and its agricultural products. There were stands that were selling Fukushima foods from Fukushima Prefecture, sake from Fukushima Prefecture. There were handicrafts. There were booths with information about tourism opportunities in Fukushima Prefecture, and generally a band and a live stage. It was a very festive and upbeat environment. And as I walked around the fair, there was one booth in which I was invited to complete a quiz for a prize. In this quiz, it was a fill in the blank, and that our task was to fill in the blanks of the names of four regions, four towns, municipalities that surround the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And if you didn't know the name of the four towns, there were some staff there on hand who would try to help you out. And once I fulfilled successfully, with their help, fill out my questionnaire, I was given the rice bag that is pictured here in this slide. This bag contained approximately 300 grams of white rice that was grown in Naraha. And Naraha is one of the towns that was named in the quiz, located south of the nuclear plant. The rice, I was assured, was safe to consume. And upon flipping the bag, it also bore a label that stated its safety. And for those who wanted more information, a quick response code, the QR code that you see there at the sort of lower right-hand corner, that you could scan with a cell phone, and that would link to a database of test results for products originating in Fukushima Prefecture. And the presence of this label begins to point to some of the difficulties for positioning products from Fukushima Prefecture and how to account for their safety. Radiation is invisible to the human senses. It doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a smell, you cannot touch it. And you need always a technological interface to be able to know how much is present in our surroundings. So the rice I took home that day, once outside its bag and in my rice cooker, could have been purchased anywhere. It actually lost its connection to the nuclear power plant and that region and all that was stated on the label. Therefore, labels and other forms of communication aimed at consumers became crucial to the task of conveying information about the production conditions and safety status of Fukushima-grown products. So in today's talk, what I want to suggest to you today is that intimacy and the concept of techno intimacy, which I will describe in a moment, became crucial components of the informations of the dynamics that unfolded that allowed Fukushima-grown products to circulate and were part of the ways in which producers were trying to reassure consumers about the production conditions and safety of these crops. So the outline for today, the way in which I'll go is that first I will sort of look at the theoretical side of things and think about concepts of intimacy and techno-intimacy. I will go over, recap a little bit of what happened in 2011, the accident, and then I will go in more detail into two ethnographic cases. One in which there was an attempt to create very direct connections between consumers and producers, and in the second one about the work of databases and this concept of techno-intimacy. Thinking about intimacy, scholars who have worked on intimacy, especially in anthropology, which is my discipline, have often noted that intimacy as a concept allows them to complicate the boundaries between the private and the public domains. That is to say, that intimacy is often assumed to exist in the private spaces. It's something that happens within households, or for example, it happens between family members in the home. And some of the work that's been done on intimacy has shown that actually what are considered to be private dynamics are actually part of larger normative discourses about power, about economics, about the structures, for example, of marriage and companionship, and so on and so forth. So, for example, scholars who have looked at, for example, I'm thinking of the work of Liba Fire, who has looked at the work of Filipino entertainers in rural Japan. She notes that actually the intimate connections that they have with their husbands cannot be understood without paying attention to the economic and power differentials between Japan and the Philippines. Now, more specifically, there's been a number of works that have come out in recent years that think about intimacy and relationships with digital technologies. Much in the same way that the multi-species turn in anthropology has looked at our relationships with other species, with non-humans, and the ways in which we can create these bonds with other species. Some of the scholarship in this domain has noted that actually we can develop similar sets of attachments or entanglements with digital technologies. Already in the 1990s, Anne Allison has written, for example, about Tamagotchis, so these little games that you had to feed these digital creatures, and actually not feeding them would cause them to perish, and how deep a connection people forged with these technologies. And Allison has also written about this in the context of the game of Pokemon, and more recently in a paper by Daniel White and Patrick Galbraith, they think about techno-intimacy in digital technologies in Japan, and the fact that nowadays some products that are, so especially AI voice speakers that are able to respond to our commands, we can develop very close relationships with these technologies, showing that actually it is possible for intimacy to arise in these kinds of spaces. An oft cited example, and this comes from the work of fiction, is the movie Her, in which someone falls in love with a digital voice assistant, and that we can really have very meaningful relationships with these technologies. Now, in that respect, Kath Weston actually takes the concept of techno-intimacy and thinks about it in the context of the food supply. She notes that actually there's been this impulse sometimes to want to know where our food comes from in this era of industrialized agriculture. We want to know provenance so that we can be reassured about the conditions of its production, about who produced it, and whether it will be safe for us. But Kath Weston notes that actually in the contemporary moment, more likely we're probably dealing primarily with databases, that being able to reach the producer and consumer, being able to connect them in a direct way becomes much more difficult when you have systems that are, for example, mixing foods from different regions or mixing animals and ground beef, that more and more we probably interact with systems of verification, that these are databases that will test food, and we can be reassured by a body of data about the conditions of production without necessarily needing to know the actual producer who stood behind some of those products. And that is a concept I will return to later today. Finally, I want to sort of think about intimacy in infrastructure. And this comes from the work of Wilson, in which he argues that actually infrastructure can be a way into the study of intimacy. Though they may seem as separate domains, people develop intimate entanglements with each other that are enabled by technologies like cell phone networks, by technologies such as the built environment, so that actually infrastructure is a way of fostering certain kinds of intimacy. And we can use that to think about how intimacy is constituted and how power shapes what is possible or not in these infrastructures. So that's sort of a little bit of an overview of sort of the theoretical work I'm drawing from, and I will leave it at that for now, but I will return to it later so that I can turn to the more specifics and sort of think through these concepts of intimacy with my ethnographic material. So just to give you a little bit of background about my research, I did most of my field work between 2011 and 2013. I arrived in Japan in September of 2011. During that time, I was based in Tokyo, and I took 12 trips to Tohoku and various areas in Miyagi and Fukushima Prefecture. And I did follow-up visits in 2014, 16, and 18. During this period, I did participant observation at study sessions and a consumer co-op, and I conducted numerous interviews with farmers, activists, retailers, experts, and government officials. So this picture that you see here is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant before the accident. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was commissioned in the early 1970s, and it was one of the largest sites in Japan, one of the largest nuclear sites. That was home to 6 reactors. And you see there in the picture, there are these cubes that you sort of see, you see 4 of them lined up, and each one of them is a nuclear reactor. On March 11, 2011, Japan was struck by the Great East Japan earthquake. This was the largest earthquake on record to have struck Japan, and it's the 4th largest earthquake in recorded history. In the wake of that earthquake, a powerful tsunami followed it that affected the northeastern coast of Japan's main island, an area known as Tohoku. And the tsunami was primarily responsible for some of the devastating loss of life that followed in the wake of the accident. And it also triggered a number of events at the nuclear power plant, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, that resulted in nuclear meltdowns and explosions at the reactors that spread a radioactive contamination throughout the area. Now, the map that you see here looks at the initial distribution of radioactive cesium 134 and 137. And what I want to draw your attention here is that you will see, if you're able to see my mouse on your screen, is that Fukushima Prefecture actually reaches into the inland. So part of what this map shows us is that radiation spread was not even throughout the prefecture. There were areas where more contamination landed, and there were areas, especially in the interior of Fukushima Prefecture, that were protected largely by a mountain chain that runs through that sort of almost line that you see there, causing uneven spread of radiation throughout the prefecture. This created different circumstances for different farmers and food producers in the region. The immediate areas around the stricken nuclear power plant were contaminated, of course, most severely, and an exclusion zone was instituted around the nuclear power plant. Now, this exclusion zone has, in recent years, been revised due to decontamination efforts, but it has been a contentious process to reopen some of these areas. Beyond the exclusion zone, there are areas of the prefecture that were radiation hotspots, and in some areas, farmers had to contend with radioactive contamination on their fields. But there are also farmers in the interior of the prefecture that were not as severely affected by the accident, but have had to contend with the symbolic associations. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was one of the few nuclear power plants that was named for the prefecture as a whole, instead of the towns where it was hosted. So the name of Fukushima has become somewhat associated with the accident, and when products originating from the interior of the prefecture also have to contend with that symbolic association with the name of the prefecture and the nuclear accident. But farmers in the interior have not did not have to contend with the same level of contamination as those closer to the nuclear power plant. Now, as I was mentioning before, in addition to contending with the uneven spread of contamination throughout the prefecture, the fact that radiation is invisible posed a real dilemma, and that radiation cannot be detected with the human senses, and in low levels, it will not cause immediate health effects. When a consumer approaches a food product that grown in Fukushima Prefecture, there are no evident features that could be used to assess its safety. And the equipment used to test food products is actually, it's expensive. Usually it's not portable. So, and it takes time to run the test. So also doing tests on the spot is usually not really an option. So therefore, actually, one really has to be able to trust that there are verification systems in place that have screened products before they reach the marketplace. And in this context, these conditions created a complicated predicament for some of the farmers I interviewed as part of my project. They were not responsible for the nuclear accident, yet they also, they felt that it became their responsibility to then be able to produce safe food and to communicate those results to their customers, and also to maintain a source of income. There are a number of sort of techniques in place that were adopted after the nuclear accident that were researched to be able to limit radiation uptake by plants, the use of certain forms of fertilizers, and farmers have turned to these to be able to produce food that is safe. Now, I want to look at this slide because I will return to this in a moment, because the unit is important. In the wake of the nuclear accident, the Japanese government adopted provisional regulation values for radioactive cesium. The standard was set at 500 becquerels per kilogram for most food products. And these standards were then revised in April of 2012 to a maximum of about 100 becquerel per kilograms for general foods. And then you see that there's more specific standards for certain products. A becquerel is a unit of radiation that measures the radioactivity present in a sample. Now, to give you a comparative sense, the European Union and the United States have standards of about 1,000 to 1,200 becquerels per kilogram. So compared to those, certainly the standards that were introduced by the Japanese government seem very, very strict. But part of what happened is that if you look at the standards that were adopted by countries that suffered from the fallout, the Chernobyl nuclear accident, you will see that the Ukraine had standards of about 40 to 70 becquerels per kilogram, Belarus 37, and Germany had one of the strictest standards in the world at 8 becquerels per kilogram. So some of the consumers that I met in Japan during my time of fieldwork, and especially during the period in which the emergency levels were up, would look at the standards that had been adopted in Belarus and Germany and wonder how can 500 be safe when Germany has decided 8 becquerels per kilogram is safe. In fact, actually, there was a moment when I visited a food store that had purchase radiation screening testing equipment and advertised that they would uphold the Ukrainian standards within their store. So this caused some of the mistrust in that these standards were safe. If we look at the test results for cesium in vegetables, this is data from the initial period after the accident. You will see that actually in the immediate aftermath of the accident, there were some products that were contaminated with higher levels of radiation. This in part is explained by products on which radiation came from the sky. Basically, it became airborne, and especially products like leafy vegetables, like something like parsley or spinach that have large surface areas could catch a lot of it. But from the next season onwards, radiation would have to be sort of absorbed from within the root systems of the plants. And luckily, actually, most of the products that are coming out of Fukushima Prefecture have shown either very low or undetectable levels of radiation. And this is something I will return to. I will show you more updated, more recent data a little bit later in the presentation. But this, I raised this to sort of contextualize where the farmers were operating in Fukushima Prefecture, that there was this, about a year afterwards, most of the products were showing very small or undetectable levels of radiation. So here I turn to my first ethnographic example. In the summer of 2014, I traveled with a fellow researcher to Fukushima Prefecture to meet with organic farmers and learn how they were coping with the effects of the nuclear accident. One of the farmers we met is someone I will call Goto-san, that's a pseudonym, and he was a cheerful person whose land was located in the interior of Fukushima Prefecture. We met at the edge of the local farmers market, and we sat under a roof that protected us from the summer sun. And while we were chatting, other farmers occasionally stopped by to exchange greetings with him. When asked him how he became interested in organic farming, he actually told us that his background was not in farming. He came from an urban family, but he was a very keen enthusiast of the outdoors. He often took hiking trips, and in those hiking trips, he sort of experienced a closer contact with nature that awakened in him a budding consciousness about the environment that later resulted in an interest in organic farming, and to be able to move to the countryside where he would have ready access to mountains. So initially he apprenticed with an established organic farmer and moved to Fukushima Prefecture several years before the nuclear accident to start a farm of his own. And when asking how he set up his farm, he explained that he set out to produce a wide range of vegetables rather than just concentrating on a select few so that he could supply, say, a department store or a supermarket. He was trying to stock a full booth at a farmer's market. And he also did direct sales to consumers in a system called Teike in Japan, in which producers and consumers are set in a direct relationship. Before the nuclear accident, he sold approximately 70% of his production directly to consumers and the remainder to a retailer that specialized in organic products and food safety. When talking about the accident, Goto-san explained that the main challenge he and his fellow farmers faced was a lack of practical knowledge. They had never dealt with a pollutant like radioactive cesium in their fields, and therefore didn't have experience in managing it. After the accident, numerous experts visited Fukushima Prefecture offering training to farmers, but Goto-san explained that it actually took several months before they could develop practical experience with the techniques they learned to limit radiation uptake. At the same time, he was also concerned whether his crops were safe to consume, and in 2011, he took samples to Fukushima City for testing at his own expense. And in the first year after the accident, spinach and mushrooms from his fields registered approximately 100 becquerels per kilogram. which was below the maximum 500 that was the food safety standard in place at the time when he did that test. From the next season onwards, much in line with the graph I showed you for the distribution of test results, he told us that his crops have shown undetectable levels of radiation. Because of the location of his farm, his farm was largely shielded from the more severe effects of the accident. But he also remained cognizant that he needed to be careful. So things like, for example, he used to collect fallen leaves in the surrounding forest to add to his compost pile. He stopped doing that in case he might be introducing contaminants into his compost pile that would then get worked into his fields. Farmers in Fukushima Prefecture after the accident saw demand and prices for their products decline. And we asked Goto-san if that had also been his experience. And what he told us was that surprisingly, he did not lose many customers. And he attributed that to the personal connections that he had cultivated with them over time. Upon learning about the accident, he understood that open communication would be crucial. And he called for a meeting with his customers, especially those who were in the prefecture, who were local, to explain his present situation. And in preparing for this meeting, he sort of scoured the internet for information, and he created a slideshow that included testing data for his field. He put in a primer about radiation, the kinds of monitoring efforts that were underway in the prefecture, and delivered this presentation to his customers, hoping that they would understand the circumstances in which he found himself and be reassured that he was proactive about taking steps to mitigate the risk of contamination. And Goto-san attributed the resilience of his business and the ability to not lose customers to those kinds of direct interactions, that consumers being able to see who stood behind their product, who made himself visible, and the efforts that he was taking visible created these bonds of intimacy between consumer and producer that allowed testing data to circulate and to reassure consumers that Goto-san was doing his best to ensure that they were receiving safe food. The Fukushima Organic Agriculture Network, to which Goto-san belonged, emphasized a similar display of openness and access to knowledge at the vegetable shop and restaurant that they opened in Tokyo, which has since sadly closed. But when I visited in 2014, the shop that they had in a suburb of Tokyo I was surprised by the extent to which each product was connected to the farmer who had produced them. The walls were lined up with pictures of the members of the network who had sort of their names, their farm, and a small message were displayed. And actually the products on offer were linked to the products on offer were linked to each farmer in the signs. One farmer, for example, in the pictures was photographed in the middle of an apple orchard. Someone else was holding a handful of mushrooms. And some farmers actually included aspects of their lives that extended beyond farming. One person was photographed with their grandchild, another one with their dog. And the signs for the products reinforce these connections. And this display of openness actually stood in contrast to major supermarkets, where sometimes it was actually very difficult to get more information about the products on offer. And the message that came across from this shop was that the collective of organic farmers were real people who stood behind their products and who made the provenance of their products and their test results clearly legible. And this actually sort of echoes some of the findings in the literature about food safety, especially in organic products, that show that actually these intimate and open displays of provenance have served to highlight quality and safety in organic products. So, for example, Peterson, in a study in Northern Europe, shows that actually organic supermarkets mediated this kind of information, and that shopkeepers would sort of take the information they knew about products and convey it to consumers to be able to create these linkages between producer and consumer. Moving to the second example, and here I want to think about different forms of intimacy, what I will call techno intimacy. Returning to the database that I discussed at the beginning of the article, at the beginning of this presentation, if you recall, there was on the label a QR code that if you scan the QR code, it would take you to this page at fukumegu.org. And the fukumegu.org is a site operated by the Fukushima Association for Securing Safety of Agricultural Products. It was established in May of 2012 to deal with the challenges posed by the nuclear accident. And the members of the website include the Fukushima Prefecture Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, numerous Fukushima agricultural cooperatives and associations, the Fukushima Fisheries Cooperative Federation, the Fukushima Consumer Federation, and some retailers. The landing page features a slideshow of agricultural crops. So you see pictures of rice paddies, strawberries, and peach trees. And you can, scrolling past that, you can see clickable banners that will take you to test results for products grown in Fukushima Prefecture. The site also has information about how tests are conducted, revitalization efforts underway in Fukushima Prefecture, and you can render the site in English, Korean, and traditional and simplified Chinese characters. So to give you a sense of how this site works, once you decide to click on an item, you will be able to narrow results by categories. So you could ask for results specific to rice, or say to vegetables, and then you would choose either say lettuce or tomatoes or shiitake mushrooms or fruit. And then you can narrow the results by whether you want to see results for the prefecture as a whole, or Fukushima Prefecture is divided into 3 areas, a coastal region, a middle valley, and the interior. So you could choose to see results for those sub-regions, or even narrow it further down into more specific sort of towns. And you can narrow it by period. So you want to see many years of data or just a specific time period. So to give you a sense what this looks like, I'm sorry that this is probably not going to show it's so detailed that it probably doesn't display very well on your site. So I will explain this. These are results for the 2018 rice crop for the entire prefecture. So I've selected all of Fukushima Prefecture for the 2018 rice crop. And if you sort of were able to sort of zoom in very clearly into the screen, you would see that actually 99.99581% of test results displayed under 25 becquerels per kilogram. And there were 23 samples that displayed between 25 and 50 becquerels per kilogram. Now, what I want to, if I wanted to sort of see more specifically the test results for the rice I was given at the fair, I was able to sort of select the coastal region of Fukushima Prefecture for the 2018 crop, select Naraha, and put in the time frame for the 2018, and I saw that the 4,312 tests were conducted, and 100% of them had tested below 25 becquerels per kilogram. Now, this might be a little bit easier to see. If we see, for example, for different crops, we'll see, for example, 2019 testing data, and I picked eggplant to pull this data out. You will see that in 2019, almost all samples for eggplant tested under 25 becquerels per kilogram, and only one sample tested between 25 and 50 becquerels per kilogram, keeping in mind that the current safety standard in Japan is below 100 becquerels per kilogram. And if we look at the data for 2021, actually 100% of them for eggplant were under 25 becquerels per kilogram. Now, what I want to highlight here, though, however, is that I want to think about how is it that this database can reassure. And you will notice that there is something that happens with the previous example that cannot happen here. This database does not connect me to a specific farmer. This database aggregates the results, but the results remain one layer removed from the actual source of production. I can narrow down the results down to a sub-region within Fukushima Prefecture, and I must be reassured that actually, because almost virtually all of the products are testing well below the safety standards, I can be reassured that they are safe. But I would not be able to know, for example, in 2019, with the data that we're seeing, where there was one sample that had slightly higher radiation test results, I would not be able to know as a consumer whether the product that I purchased was that one. This database operates in a different way, in which it sort of remains one level removed, where I cannot make that final connection between product and the test result in such a close way. But that doesn't mean that the database cannot be a source of reassurance. In fact, the hope is that actually through the sheer volume of data and the overwhelming sense in which data is coming under 25 becquerels per kilogram, is that we will be able to be reassured. And in fact, this is the example that I want to finish with, is an example that I saw during my fieldwork of how a body of data can become a form of reassurance. In the initial period after the accident, before more user-friendly databases could be developed, there was a lot of the testing data was being released in these really long PDFs and spreadsheets that were very difficult to scrutinize and to figure out how products were testing. There were just these endless PDFs that would come out in very tiny script. There was a group in Tokyo, a group of concerned mothers that took on the task of trying to sort through this data and to share their findings via an email digest service. And in these in the data sets that they scrutinized were reported in a very similar format to the database. They indicated the prefecture and town of origin for the products, but those test results did not connect them to a specific producer or farm. And the email digest that this group circulated highlighted products that exceeded the regulation values, and also highlighted products that actually were showing some amount of radiation, but were testing below the maximum allowable under the safety standards. During the summer of 2013, I attended an event in which one of the members of the group shared with the audiences an open event, a slideshow that summarized testing data for the previous 6 months. This first slide featured a pie chart that visualized the number of times a category of products reported radiation in excess of the regulation values, and the speaker encouraged us to exercise caution when considering these products. So in this case, wild meats, wild boar, and some seafood categories were the main categories reported. And in the next slide that we saw a map that visualized areas in northeastern Japan where some contaminated bamboo shoots had been detected, and we were encouraged to exercise caution. However, by contrast, the final slide in that presentation summarized products that could be eaten with confidence because the data had revealed them to be of no concern. Amongst these products were, for example, bean sprouts, strawberries, melons, and a few others. The slide emphasized a message of trustworthiness by including cartoon pictures of a female character dressed in an apron chopping a carrot, suggesting the presence of a mother cooking a meal, and 2 smiling farmers holding mature rice stalks. Well, safe products in Japan are often described as having both anzen, which refers to safety, and anshin, which refers to peace of mind or trustworthiness. And the final slide featuring safe foods described them as products that could be eaten with anshin or with peace of mind. And the body of data that they had consulted revealed these insights that allowed these consumers to describe food products as trustworthy based on this body of data that they use to know something about them and the conditions of production. So what I want to suggest in this context, a corpus of data can provide general guidance about the status of crops after the nuclear accident. It does not connect consumers to particular producers or test results, but rather facilitates a connection between the general public and a body of data. It offers reassurance about food by drawing attention to a large body of testing data and provides an alternative method by which consumers can seek reassurance without needing to know the specific field or farmer who stands behind the product. So what I would like to suggest is that Techno Intimacy emerged as a relational force that seeks to allow consumers to navigate an uncertain marketplace with access to aggregated data, and that it could go some way towards reassuring consumers that products from this region could be eaten with a peace of mind. Now, I'm going to here draw things to a conclusion. And the first thing that I want to do is to offer a caveat that I've discussed two cases today, but these two cases are not a direct comparison. They're very different. They're producers working at very different scales and reaching different kinds of consumers. So I don't offer these two cases as a way of comparing them, but I think that they're good to think side by side about how intimacy played a role in traveling alongside test results for radiation to help constitute products as safe. And organic farmers like Goto-san share testing data with their customers about their crops and very personal stories about their efforts to monitor radiation in their fields. This allowed producers and their consumers to have a relationship in which radiation test results could be communicated and trusted. These crops were not anonymous, but were products grown by a trusted farmer willing to share how the commodity was produced and the test results for its safety. This intimate relationship between producer and consumer allowed test results to be embedded in the context of a social relationship and therefore be more readily trusted. And what I want to suggest is that the database that we looked at operates on a slightly different logic regarding intimacy. It shifts the focus away from particular producers and towards a system of verification and a body of data. Perusing this website shows that there are millions of tests that have been conducted on Fukushima-grown products. And the idea is that this kind of techno intimacy that emerges will allow consumers to be reassured about the food they purchase without necessarily needing to know the specific farmer who stands behind it. Rather, the database acts as a symbol and sort of the repository of a system that verifies the conditions of production, so consumers can shop with confidence, even if they only have access to aggregated results. Techno Intimacy here seeks to enable relationships of trust that do not supplant direct access to the conditions of production, but they actually shift the source of reassurance towards a body of data and the systems of verification that produced it. And altogether, my argument today is actually intimacy worked as a key variable that accompanied the circulation of data to reassure consumers about the status of Fukushima-grown products. With that, I thank you for your attention and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for a very interesting talk. For notes for the audience, if you have any questions, please either leave your questions using the chat functions or raise your hands. I think there's a button in the Zoom window so you can raise your hands and let us know if you want to leave your comments or ask a question. So before, well, since I'm the host, let me take the advantage of my positions and ask some questions. I'm actually quite fascinating by your choice of talking about intimacy to as the medium, as the way in to talk about why people trust certain food instead of others. So for one thing, I know this is maybe a little bit far-fetched, but I wonder, like, for example, you talk about the Techno Intimacy or the data set. So first question is, for some reason, it's that talk, that part of the talk reminds me of the concept fetishism. It's a bit, again, as I said, it's a little bit far away, but what I have in mind is there is a relations that people attach certain value to it. Of course, the term fetishism have the implications of attach more value than it actually has. But whether it is the organic farmers, talking, showing, oh, I'm here, I am, doing, personalize, a humanize certain products or commodities, would it be also a certain form of fetishisms about human relations, especially when it comes to organic products? Here, I'm also thinking about Zigzag's talking about cultural capitalism. The capitalism way of promoting consumptions nowadays, it is not enough to have just mass production, but it also have to create certain symbolic values, certain cultural value. And one of the example he gave is, the coffee shops that promotes, oh, this is organic farming. The coffee beans come from organic farming, or we purchase our coffee beans from fair trades, and so on and so forth. So that kind of an extra layer of relationships that create that value in the food, rather than beyond something what a more maybe a more a Marxist, a usual Marxist arguments about labor and so on. I'll stop here. I'm not sure that I explained myself well. Feel free to ask me.
Thank you for the question. And I think with the one thing I would note is actually doing that kind of direct connection with consumers. Some of the things that I heard from organic farmers when I was interviewing, and this is something that Nancy Rosenberger has written quite a bit about the organic movement in Japan, and she's also noted this in her work, is that it takes a lot of work on the part of farmers to do that kind of outreach. You have to be writing newsletters. I remember Nancy Rosenberger reports on farmers sometimes seeking to do personal deliveries to create these connections, and it becomes another part of the work of farming, which can be very time consuming. Now, I think what I heard when I was doing interviews with organic farmers at the time was that actually this had become a very crucial aspect of the work of farming in the wake of the nuclear accident, that organic farmers, their customers were usually people who were concerned about food safety and were making choices to source organic products. So they needed to sort of go the extra mile to be able to reassure their customers that they were taking precautionary efforts. The other thing that I remember is we interviewed a farmer who had a small inn, and that it was a fruit orchard. And they noted that they understood very well why consumers, especially in Tokyo, could be concerned about their products. They said, like, something really catastrophic happened here, and I understand their concerns. And what they wished was if they could only come here and see directly what we're doing and said, we are actually monitoring, we are decontaminating, we are taking all these precautionary things, we're screening the products, but they're worried that those efforts were not visible, that like the distance between producer and consumer could be so great to render those efforts invisible. So if they could come here, they would, perhaps their perspective would shift. And I think some of those communication efforts were trying to sort of bridge that sort of possibility of invisibility, so to speak, that they needed to make it visible. So I think I take your point that certainly this has become a selling card sometimes for some food products, that actually these systems of verification and labels have become part of a form of distinction for some products. But I think for some of the farmers that I met, they saw this as very necessary work, that in order to be able to sustain those relationships.
Well, thank you. Anyone in the audience may have a question or comment?
Yeah, may I have a quick one? So I was just thinking about how, your conceptualization, which I think is very, very unique, that you're talking about, the relationship with technology, intimacy, and trust. But actually, this kind of performance of values are kind of everywhere in our society, not just Fukushima. So I think it has a very broad application. But I just hope to know that, is there any kind of counter performances of these kind of values, like, people who really organize events to kind of dissociate people's imaginaries of this, product as safe, or something like that. Because I could see that similar values of, for example, justice, of democracy, could also be kind of constructed and deconstructed.
That's an interesting question. I did not attend those events, so I never saw it done in such an explicit way to try to undo some of that work. I think more generally, especially like during my fieldwork, I think there was a general sense of unease about how does life proceed after the nuclear accident, and a sense, and I did meet consumers who were worried about the status of products, especially consumers who had, in particular, families with small children. And in that sense, it wasn't necessarily the work of trying to undo some of these efforts, but a sense that I need to be cautious, that this was a disaster, that it was such a spectacular failure of this technology, such a monumental catastrophe, that this moment warrants caution. So for the time being, let me, for example, just eat products that are grown further away, and just so draw a little bit of a boundary. And there are some sort of surveys that have shown this, that actually there were people, consumers in the Tokyo area, who were avoiding products grown in northern Japan altogether out of this sense of safety. That feeling has sort of like, it hasn't disappeared. It actually has, in these large surveys, it has decreased over time, but it actually sort of climbed actually in the few years after the accident. So it reveals a sense that this was a moment that called for caution, and that was sort of the predicament that some of these farmers found themselves in, is that, of course, they also needed to, this was a source of income, and like some of them may have had outstanding loans or like other financial commitments, and there were most of their crops were testing well below the safety standards. So these were some of the challenges they needed to overcome to reassure consumers. There was a sense, I mean, this of course it turned out very differently, but in the 2018 event that I referenced at the very beginning of my talk, where that fair where I was giving the rise, part of some of the speeches were calling attention to the fact that they were hoping that the Olympic Games would actually give Fukushima a platform to reintroduce itself to the world. And there were some events slated to be held over there. And of course, because of the COVID pandemic and the postponement of the Olympics, that actually these plans were not that was not possible the way they had envisioned. But in 2018, when I saw those displays actually at several events where some of the officials from Fukushima Prefecture were sort of looking forward to that moment of attention about the world, to be able to say, is this now the moment when we can try to turn the page to some extent?
So we have a audience who would like to ask a question. Anushri, sorry, I'm not sure do I pronounce your name right?
No, that's correct. Thank you. Thank you. So I really sort of want to start off with saying that I really enjoyed the presentation, and I find I came across the Dr. Nicholas's work recently with respect to my own research, and I'm also sort of looking at food systems in the context of the pandemics. I've been trying to understand like the larger context of the disaster and how that changes things with respect to food supplies. And it was really fascinating for me to go through some of your work in that aspect. So, I mean, one of the questions, I kind of have two questions, but I'll start with the one that I can maybe try and articulate a little bit more clearly. The paper that I think the first paper that I referred to from your body of work was around the food activists and how their work sort of becomes a criticism of the state, and how in their activities also they launch a critique of the state and the kind of standards that the state is setting. So would you, like, after hearing your presentation, I was curious if there was a similar kind of parallel in the organic farmers example also? And if, like, how can we think about the absence or presence of a parallel there? That was kind of the first question. The second question, I think this is more drawing upon my own work, where so the key kind of thematic in my work is to sort of try and understand entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurial affects. So one of the kind of directions of thought there is also if agency emerges as a thing in relation to intimacy, or the intimate relationships that both appear between consumers and producers in both these examples, and if that's something that has come up, or if you've thought about that, and you can talk about that a little bit. Yeah, those two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions, and for having sort of like from my work. That's always nice to hear that it's circulating. Those are very interesting questions. The first one, thinking about the critique of the state, and you're right that actually in my larger work, that's part of what I focus on is sort of that moment of this really concern and dissatisfaction with how the state has handled sort of safety in that regard. In interviews with farmers, I did come across similar sort of themes, that actually many farmers also felt that they had been they were being, I think they were in this predicament in which they were not responsible for the nuclear accident, but they had to deal with the effects of the accident in a very tangible way. And this was in a sense that the nuclear power plants had been built with this promise that they were absolutely safe technologies, that there was no risk almost in having them there. And a sense that actually that promise broke down. And in some interviews with farmers, I remember some farmers told me that that they believed in the safety of the nuclear reactors until they didn't anymore, and they realized at that moment that they needed to be a lot more careful on and so how to put it, that they realized that they had been, one person I remember clearly telling me that he had been wrong to believe in the absolute safety of these things, and that he needed to be a lot more cautious about accepting these statements of safety. Now, for some of the farmers that do this kind of production, they also supply, especially parts of the co-op movement or some other specialized retailers. And one of the things that happened in the wake of the nuclear accident in Japan is that a number of co-ops and private retailers developed their own private standards that were stricter than what the state required. So for farmers working with these private organizations, they would have to be able to produce to the standards that these private standards that went beyond compliance. So as I mentioned, there was this store in Tokyo for a while that was upholding the Ukrainian standards. Some of the co-op movements that they had standards about a half of what the government required. It varied from organization to organization, but in a sense that was part of the, they could enforce stricter standards also through their venues of supply. Now, for other farmers, it was actually, because so much of their crops were coming with, especially a year or two afterwards, were showing undetectable levels of radiation, especially for those who had direct sales to consumers. They were trying to embed those radiation test results in their newsletters to consumers, that in a sense, a private standard was actually, like, they didn't need to put a threshold because they were already showing such low levels of radiation. Now, the second question I think that you had was about entrepreneurialism and agency. And that was an interesting, I mean, this might be a roundabout way of getting at your question, but I remember in some interviews that we conducted with farmers, they noted that actually there was a new class of consumer who emerged after the nuclear accident that was there to support them. And that these were, like, in as much as some people pulled back from buying products from the region because they were worried about their provenance and possible association with the nuclear accident, there were also some consumers who were deliberately trying to support food producers in the affected regions. And they said, well, of course, they were very grateful for the support, but they were also very mindful that they could not count upon that in the long term, that they could not count upon people who are seeking to support them because of this event as a viable business strategy. That in the long run, what they had to be able to convince people that their products were just great and that they deserved consumer interest and people's money basically in their own right. So there were farmers trying out new strategies for how to appeal to consumers, how to position their new products. In that sense, there was a little bit of that entrepreneurialism emerging, but I think that came out, at least in my experience of the interviews, that came a little bit later. That initially, the first couple of years were actually very intense moments of trying to learn to deal with the effects of the accident.
Well, there are questions from guest Novo5 Pro in the chat box. So it is said, thanks for your talk. I would like to ask two questions here. First, what's the difference or connections between your intimacy and Michael Hirschfeld's intimacy? Second, it seems that customers are easier to trust the food test results or certificates compared with Chinese consumers. I'm curious why. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Let me start with the second one. And of course, I I mean, I would love to sort of do a panel side by side with some people working in the Chinese context and thinking about these ideas. I haven't done field work in China, so I don't have a good sense for that. But I think it could be a very interesting conversation side by side. The one thing I would note is actually that the numbers in of themselves were not automatically trusted. So one of the things that I, for example, found when I was doing my research is that people became very savvy citizens who were concerned about food safety became very knowledgeable about the conditions of testing. So it wasn't just a matter of whether the test results showed this or that, but further questions could be made. So in the case of testing these products for radiation, the length of the test makes a difference. If you run a very quick test, the detection levels are higher. So if it has a very small amount within the sample, it will show as non-detected. But if you run the test for a longer period of time, the test becomes more sensitive and is able to basically reveal smaller amounts of radioactive components present in the sample. So some of the things that I found, for example, was that consumers, some of these concerned consumers and citizens would say, well, sure, here's a test result, but for how long was the test conducted? And that actually the detection limit was an important variable in that. There were also concerns, for example, was the test conducted on brown rice or white rice? Because some of the seasons sometimes tended to accumulate more on the brown rice, on the outer layer of the brown part of the husk. So if the rice had been milled, it may have led to something different. So I don't want to suggest that the results automatically were trusted. There was still a lot of scrutiny about them. I think where I saw results beginning to be accepted was not so much an individual result, but as a body of data. And that's what I'm hoping that I sort of convey with today's presentation, is that it was being able to see the thousands and thousands of aggregated test results that showed a certain pattern, that for some of the people that I met while I was doing my research in Japan, that seemed to confirm for them that, okay, yes, some of these products can be eaten with confidence. So I remember doing an interview with someone who had been looking at this data, who told me, well, I used to be very concerned about, for example, say cherry tomatoes, but I looked at the data and I saw all the thousands of measurements that have been made about cherry tomatoes, and I'm not worried about those anymore. So rather than being concerned, trying to write off these regions altogether, that I cannot consume anything that is grown there, her caution had become a lot more targeted in that case. So it was actually, I know that bamboo shoots have recently presented some issues, so I will avoid bamboo shoots, but cherry tomatoes or strawberries, I can eat fine. I do not need to concern myself. So it was a little bit more about, it was like the body of data rather than the individual measurement that I think contributed to that. For the second question, my connection to Michael Hertzfeld's concept of intimacy, that's interesting. Actually, when I started this research, I went back to read Michael Hertzfeld's work on intimacy, but in the end, I ended up locating my work a little bit along different interlocutors than him. I think in part, I end up being more persuaded in my thinking about works that dealt with infrastructure, and that a database is a form of infrastructure, in this case, a digital infrastructure. And I was trying to think about how a digital infrastructure can create the conditions for these sort of the reason. So let me rephrase that. I think the reason why this was a question that I think some of you have raised before, why intimacy, is eating is a very intimate activity, in that it really, in a very literal way, it connects the body to the environment that surrounds it, and that it actually we're literally ingesting our surrounding environments. And sometimes that can be a source of pleasure. So like expensive French wines that sort of argue that they are reflective of the region and that they become a source of pleasure. That embodied connection to place can be a source of pleasure, but in this case also, it could also be a source of anxiety. That am I ingesting products? Am I ingesting radioactive compounds that could harm my body? So in that sense, because food is such an intimate connection to our surroundings, I was trying to think about the way in which a database and digital infrastructure can create the conditions by which that intimate act of eating can be realized. And I think in that sense, I moved in a slightly different direction than some of Michael Herzfield's work on some of like the cultural scripts, sort of like those scripts of cultural intimacy that bond us as a group, as a collective. So I think I was sort of like moving in a slightly different direction than where he was thinking about intimacy. And I assume that this is more of a question about the idea of cultural intimacy and social poetics. But if not, please follow up and tell me how you were thinking about that question.
Anyone else have other comments or questions? Loretta, please.
Can you see me, or I can't see myself for some reasons. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Hi, Nico. How are you? Thank you very much for your talk. I think I was really struck by a couple of things. So the first one is how willing the consumers are, make an effort to gather or to read through those information. So you've mentioned that at first it was actually quite difficult to access those data, even though they were available, but they were in these like difficult PDF forms. And then I think you said they make it more accessible. But still, I think for a regular consumer willing to, with all the things going on in people's lives, willing to go through all those piles of data to figure out what is what is safe to consume and what is not, I think it in itself is remarkable. And I just presume at the beginning of the disaster back in 10 years ago, 10, 15, I can see why people with a heightened sense of anxiety would be going through that. But can you maybe say a little bit more as time goes by? How do people's attitudes change with this figuring out through this data set what is safe to consume and what is not? And my second question is, I wonder if, and the other thing that struck me is how much they trust the database. And of course, you mentioned that it's not just one report, there are many of them, and that's what convinced people eventually. But I wonder if there are initiatives, amongst the people that you study who actually do their own environmental research, their own citizen science project in this scenario. Are there things like that, or they're just relying on the data that are posted by the authority? Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are great questions, and I'm glad you raised them, because they'll allow me to sort of say a few things that I wasn't able to put into the presentation, but that do address some important issues. Let me start with your second question first about the official data. I should note that this is, of course, not this is one of the sets of measurements that exist, and it's actually very voluminous, and I use it as an example. There are other places where you can go and look at data, and there was a network of, not necessarily there was a collection of citizen testing centers that emerged in the wake of the crisis, where some of these measurements were also being made. So actually one of Yasuhito Abe, who's a scholar in Japan, he's in Kyoto right now. He's written a lot about these sort of citizen science aggregator sites and the way in which some of these citizen testing centers started sharing results with each other to create alternative databases, so that the official sort of results database were not the only one, so that you could turn to other places to see results. Some of the co-ops, for example, that open in-house testing labs and were producing their own measurements about the food on offer for them, they also would have databases where you could go and take a look at the test results. So I think you're absolutely right. By no means was this the only body of data out there. It does stand out for the scope of it. I think that there's so much data. At some up until recently, Fukushima Prefecture had a policy of testing all. It was called the all bags rice. So they had created these systems where you could sort of run these bags of rice through kind of like a conveyor belt system, and so they were able to sort of look at all the rice produced in the prefecture. They recently changed that procedure, but that's why I look at this database, because it stands out for its scope. But there were certainly other bodies of data circulating out there that you could turn to if concerns. And in my research, I talked to some of the people running these citizen testing centers, and you would have some of them that actually serviced farmers, and farmers would come and verify the safety of their products at them. Goto-san, for example, who I introduced as one of the examples, he turned to one of the citizen testing centers at the beginning of the crisis to be able to verify the status of his own crops. Some of these centers were also used by citizens. For example, at one center, I was told that sometimes people who received presents from relatives living in the northern areas of Japan would sometimes verify their safety if they were sending them agricultural products. And that was sort of one of the uses. So in that sense, there were multiple bodies of data out there. Over time, your first question, I have to answer this question with a caveat, in that doing research about this event highlighted for me how sort of the partial view of anthropological fieldwork, that my main period of fieldwork was 2011 to 2013, and I have done sort of follow-up visits later on, but in a way, what I saw, I captured to the extent that was a partial slice of a moment in time. So I think some of that extended view will emerge through like actually collaborative scholarship, that there are other people doing this kind of work now, and it can be read as a sort of so I'm really fascinated by the findings of people who have done field work more recently, and how this has been normalized, and the ways in which the kind of data that they collected. I would say within that sort of constraint of when I did my field work, constantly checking the provenance of products can become very tiring. It's almost impossible. I mean, if we had to, I mean, even outside the context of a nuclear disaster, going to the grocery store and trying to verify that everything in there is safe, like we would never be able to leave the store because we would get diluted in too much information. So I think part of what I saw was sort of a sense that routines had to emerge, and sort of systems had to emerge for people to be able to manage that uncertainty. So in some cases that resulted in, I did meet, for example, consumers in Tokyo who said, you know, this is so much, there's so much uncertainty and moving pieces with this that I'm going to try not to buy food from those areas. And there was approximately in large surveys in 2013, 2014, I believe the figure was around 18, 19% of people said that they would rather avoid products. More recently, that figure has dropped to around 9%. So there were certainly people whose strategy was that. there were people I met, especially because I did some of my research in the co-op movement, that if you were part of these networks where there were private safety standards in place that were screening food to stricter standards, going into that store, you could be reassured, I know that they've screened everything, so I don't need to think about it. And I can shop confidently in this space. So, and I don't think I cannot make a generalized statement about how people routinized it. Like if there was, but there were multiple ways in which people try to fold it into their everyday, because otherwise it becomes unsustainable. It would debilitate you to the point that shopping becomes very difficult. So there is a sense of that these things had to be turned into everyday shopping routines on the part of consumers.
Brendan, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for this really wonderful talk. I actually taught your book last spring to a food anthropology seminar, so then it's great to hear this sort of follow up to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just curious a little bit, and I'm a China scholar, as someone else was asking you questions about this too. But obviously, I read quite a bit on Japan within working in East Asia. But I'm curious. One question I had was, with all these different actors you're talking about, whether it be the co-ops or the farmers and so forth, is there any kind of stratification based on gender in terms of citizen science and in terms of monitoring the effects and the data and so forth? I'm thinking, obviously you mentioned some sort of people in Japan studies anthropology like Allison, and I'm thinking of her classic piece on Japanese mothers and the lunches and so forth, and that there's sort of a curating food, has a gendered aspect, and then even Nancy Rosenberger's work on female farmers versus male farmers and that sort of thing. So I'm curious, because you work with so many different actors, it made me wonder, beginning to stick in the back of my head, well, is there kind of any stratification across gender in these different groups?
So thank you for your question. That's an interesting point to raise. The group that I mentioned that was parsing through the government data and and releasing an email digest, that was a group of mothers, and it was there were a number of these organizations that were sort of like an association to protect children from radiation, and they would be localized to a particular sort of town or municipality. And it was a group of mothers who were very conscious of their status of mothers. And I didn't include that today in the discussion today, but I had a chance to talk with someone who was a member of that group. And it was interesting, in our discussion, she noted that her ideas of the work of motherhood had also changed as a result of participating in this network. That it had sort of shifted a little bit, in the sense that though she might have initially joined from a desire to make sure that her children and her family was safe, part of what she noticed is that participating in motherhood had become a little bit more of a collective endeavor, where, okay, here's a network of mothers with whom I can share these resources, and we can come at it from this perspective. So I think there was certainly a sense that this was there was a very conscious positioning of themselves as, we're here inspired by this maternal love, but this is not just about wanting that our children are safe, but we're concerned about the welfare of children more generally. And that was sort of part of what sort of came out in these conversations, is that this was an important shift that happened through participation in that network. In terms of farmers, I mean, I did interview female farmers, but I don't know if I have enough of a sense to be able to say whether there was a gender division in how they approached this. I think probably Nancy Rosenberger would be a better person to stuff like, but she, I think, like explore this much more so systematically. I don't think I was so systematic in that respect. In that, even though sometimes I interviewed farmers as couples, so it was a married couple who was farming. Sometimes we did interview female farmers and male farmers. But I couldn't find a particular variable in that body of data. But I think, of course, that doesn't mean that there are no gender dynamics there. I think certainly that they could be there. And I think the other thing I would like to say about sort of this question of gender is that some of the, especially thinking about the example that I was giving about the group that was looking at the data, sometimes, especially sort of groups of mothers, there were sometimes sort of called out for somehow not heeding scientific advice, that their fears about radiation and their desires for somehow like a zero risk approach were somehow counterproductive to the efforts to move beyond the disaster towards national reconstruction. And what I hope it comes from that result is, at least with these groups of mothers that I met there, is that this was not they were actually very savvy about reading the data, and they were studying, they were inviting guest speakers to teach them about the science of radiation, and they were actually working their way through government data. So this was not they very much resisted that characterization that they were somehow being that they were not heeding these scientific advices, but they were actually very much working their way through the data to arrive at a place where they could say, okay, I feel confident about this.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you. I think time is approaching 11 p.m. in this part of East Asia. Thank you very much, Nicole, today for sharing your research with us. And thank you everyone else for joining us. Please, I look forward to seeing you in our next event. Please follow us on our website, Sci-Tech Asia, Facebook, WeChat, and other social media. And have a good day.